Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy corridors of Topkapi Palace, where the air smells like rosewater and betrayal. You're barefoot on cold marble, watching as a 6-year-old girl, let's call her Leyla because history erased her real name, is draped in a wedding gown heavier than she is. The Sultan's ring swallows her tiny finger whole. Before you think this can't be real, remember, you probably wouldn't survive a week in this gilded nightmare. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The hush of silk slippers against marble follows you as you peer through the lattice screen. Leyla's feet dangle a full inch above the floor, while eunuchs adjust her pearl-encrusted veil. She swings her legs absently, like she's sitting on a garden swing rather than preparing for her wedding night. Around her, the harem walls bloom with tulip motifs, the Ottoman symbol of fleeting beauty, in a twist that feels almost cruel in its irony. A senior concubine pinches color into Leyla's cheeks. The child doesn't cry. She stopped crying after her third beating during wedding protocol rehearsals. The Ottomans didn't invent child marriage, but they perfected its bureaucracy. Sultan Suleiman's legal code technically set the marriage age at puberty, but a well-placed bribe could make a 6-year-old blossoming in the eyes of the court. Historians still argue whether these unions were about politics, perversion, or simple dynastic math. The answer's probably all three. That doll lying discarded in the corner, a gift from the Sultan. Its porcelain face is cracked straight down the middle. The Sultan isn't some mustache-twirling villain. That's what makes this so unsettling. He's 29, devout, and genuinely believes this marriage will stabilize his empire. You watch him kneel for evening prayers, forehead pressed devoutly to his prayer rug, before he signs the contract trading a child's innocence for a favorable border treaty. His ink-stained fingers handle the parchment with the same care he'll soon, well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The mainstream history books will tell you this was normal for the era, but here's a quirky detail they omit. The wedding contract includes a clause about growth expectations, like a medieval prenup speculating on when Leyla's hips might widen enough for childbearing. The palace doctors have already examined her and filed a report noting she hasn't lost her baby teeth yet. Outside the palace walls, commoners celebrate what they believe to be a joyous occasion. Street vendors sell honey-drenched pastries shaped like wedding knots, while poets compose odes to the Sultan's generosity in taking on such a young bride. None of them see how Leyla's tiny hands tremble when they place the ceremonial silver mirror in her lap, a tradition meant to reflect her happy future. The mirror's so heavy it nearly topples into her lap. That lute music you hear, it's supposed to be festive, but tonight it sounds like a funeral dirge. And if you listen closely between the notes, you can just make out the sound of Leyla's mother weeping in a distant chamber, the one family member who objected and was promptly relocated to a nunnery in Edirne. The really chilling part, this isn't even the worst case historians have uncovered. Scrolls in the Topkapi archives mention a 5-year-old married to a governor in 1582, though scholars still debate whether that marriage was ever consummated. The wedding procession begins at midnight, because nothing says holy matrimony like holding a child ceremony during the witching hour. You're pressed against a marble column as Leyla is carried through the palace on a silver litter, her small frame nearly disappearing beneath layers of embroidered silk. The weight of her headdress forces her chin to her chest, giving the illusion of modesty rather than the reality of a neck too weak to bear its burden. Around her, torchlight flickers against the gilded walls, casting elongated shadows that look suspiciously like grasping hands. The scent of ambergris and fear hangs thick in the air. One of the eunuchs catches your eye and shakes his head slightly. A warning. You're not supposed to be here. No one is supposed to see this part. The mainstream historical record will later describe this as a joyous union, but right now you're witnessing the truth. A little girl being carried toward a bedroom where the sheets have been perfumed with rosewater to mask the scent of tears. Here's a fact your history teacher definitely skipped. Ottoman wedding contracts often included a maturity clause stating the marriage wouldn't be consummated until the bride reached puberty. But scroll down to the fine print. There's always a loophole allowing the husband to override this if he obtained. Let's call it special dispensation. And guess who signs those dispensations? the same judges whose salaries come from the Sultan's coffers. A quirky detail that survived in the palace kitchen logs: the staff prepared a special bridal supper of mashed apricots and milk, the same meal they served to weaning infants. Historians still argue whether this was meant to be kind or cruel. Meanwhile, Leyla's new husband feasts on lamb stuffed with pine nuts across the hall, laughing with his viziers about some joke lost to time. The sound carries through the latticed walls, mingling with the faint hiccuping sobs no one is allowed to acknowledge. Dawn breaks over the Bosphorus like a slow bruise, first pale yellow, then purple, then an angry red. You're hiding in the palace gardens now, watching as servants scurry to dispose of the evidence. One carries a bundle of linens so heavy with rosewater that droplets leave a trail on the flagstones. Another empties a copper basin into the fountain, its contents swirling pink before dissolving into nothingness. The mainstream history books will claim the marriage wasn't consummated for years, but you just spent the night listening to muffled screams through 2 feet of marble. Here's a fact they don't teach in schools. Ottoman physicians kept detailed growth charts for child brides, marking their hip measurements in a ledger like livestock records. Leyla's page shows 12 months of entries in different inks, the handwriting growing progressively shakier as the same doctor signs his name week after week. A darkly comic detail from the Harem gossip logs: the Sultan's mother initially objected to the match, not out of morality, but because she worried a child bride would be bad for his reputation abroad. Her solution: order the court poets to compose verses describing Leyla as a womanly 12 in all official correspondence. The scribes got creative, once referring to her as blooming like a pomegranate in high summer, a neat trick for a girl who still played with dolls. Historians still argue whether these marriages were about control, legacy, or something darker. But right now, as you watch a servant girl bury a child-sized nightgown in the compost heap, the only debate that matters is happening in your own gut. That's when you notice the tiny handprint on the garden wall, fresh enough that the mortar is still damp. It's at knee height for an adult, right where a child might brace herself against the stones. The morning after the wedding, the palace hums with carefully orchestrated normalcy. You watch from a shadowed alcove as servants arrange platters of figs and cheese outside the Sultan's chambers, breakfast for 2, though only one set of cutlery shows any signs of use. A maid emerges carrying a tray with a single untouched glass of pomegranate juice, its surface now filmed over in the humid air. The ice chips meant to keep it cool have melted into sad little islands. Down in the courtyard, a group of seamstresses pretend not to notice how they've been ordered to let out all the seams on a child's sleeping gown. Their needles flash in the sunlight like tiny accusations. Here's a mainstream fact that'll curdle your coffee. Ottoman law required 3 days of gifting ceremonies after royal weddings. For Leyla, this means being propped up on cushions for hours while dignitaries present her with jewelry she can't possibly wear, a diamond collar that would choke her, rings that slip right off her fingers. The Grand Vizier makes a show of kissing her tiny hand, his beard scratching her knuckles. You see her flinch, but the court poets will later describe this moment as the bride's charming modesty. Meanwhile, the Sultan accepts gifts of stallions and swords, the traditional presents for a man who's just proven his virility. By the 3rd day, Leyla has developed a cough. The palace physicians murmur about autumn chills as they dose her with a syrup made of black cumin and opium. You linger near the sickroom door, catching glimpses of the child through the lattice screen. She's curled in a nest of pillows, clutching that same cracked doll like a lifeline. Every time a eunuch enters with more medicine, she shrinks further into the bedding. The doctor's ledger notes her fever in precise script, but makes no mention of the bruises peeking above her collar, 5 small fingerprints in the exact configuration of a grown man's grip. Historians still argue whether these child brides were treated with kindness behind closed doors. But here's a quirky detail that survived in the kitchen records. The Sultan's mother secretly ordered extra honey cakes sent to Leyla's chambers, not out of compassion, but because fattening up the child might hasten her readiness. The pastry chef, a father of 3 himself, began slipping in ginger candies known to soothe the stomach, his silent rebellion recorded in the sugar expenditure logs. The first snow falls on Constantinople as Leyla's cough worsens. You watch through frosted palace windows as physicians bleed her with silver lancets, catching the ruby droplets in a porcelain bowl shaped like a blooming tulip, that Ottoman symbol of ephemeral beauty coming back to haunt us. Her tiny arm barely yields 3 ounces before the head doctor clicks his tongue and calls for the cautery iron. The scent of burning flesh mixes strangely with the rosewater they've sprinkled to calm the humours. Down in the courtyard, the Sultan's new stallion, one of those wedding gifts, rears up violently and breaks its tether. The stable boys whisper that animals always know when something's wrong in the palace. Here's a fact that never made the official chronicles. The harem maintained special recovery chambers for child brides, walled with padded silk and stocked with poppy tinctures. The rooms were designed by a Persian architect who later went mad and drowned himself in the Bosphorus. Historians still argue whether his final note, "The walls scream louder than the girls," referred to these very chambers. As you press your ear against Leyla's door, you realize the walls are indeed strangely resonant, amplifying every whimper into a chorus. By the new moon, the whispers change. Servants start leaving offerings at the little mosque of Harem Sultan, candles, amulets, once even a child's slipper with the toes worn through. You follow a eunuch down a back staircase and discover why. Leyla's been moved to the Moon Pavilion, the palace's traditional place for convalescences that won't end well. The room floats on the Golden Horn like a gilded prison, its lattice windows filtering moonlight into dagger-sharp patterns across the sickbed. The doll lies abandoned on the floor now, its cracked face staring blankly at the ceiling where someone has painted a fresco of Icarus falling. A darkly poetic detail from the physician's notes. They switched from opium to henbane when her cough turned bloody, which means her final dreams would have been full of winged demons and laughing shadows. The last entry in her growth chart simply reads, 16.2 hands, a stable master's measurement accidentally left on the page where her hip measurements should be. That night, as the call to prayer echoes across the water, you see the Sultan standing alone on the sea wall. He's holding something small and white that flutters in the wind like a surrender flag. It takes 3 gusts before you recognize Leyla's first baby tooth, saved in a scrap of wedding veil. The palace bells don't toll when Leyla dies. Instead, a single blue ribbon appears on the harem gates, Ottoman code for a child's passing. You watch as servants scrub the Moon Pavilion with vinegar and thyme, their brushes scraping away the last traces of her existence. In the courtyard below, the Sultan's new favorite, a Circassian girl of 14, practices her lute, plucking the same wedding song that played for Leyla just months before. The musicians have transposed it to a major key now, as if that could erase the memory of its original haunting minor melody. A kitchen slave slips you a scrap of parchment stained with fig jam, the palace accountant's notation for one child-sized coffin, plain cedar, no inscriptions. The charge appears between lamp oil and stable feed. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic indifference was cruelty or kindness. After all, anonymous graves couldn't become pilgrimage sites for malcontents. But here's a fact you won't find in the archives. The gravediggers added an extra foot to the hole, not for treasures or tokens, but because 6-year-olds should have room to kick in their sleep. Spring arrives with brutal indifference. Wisteria vines climb the palace walls, their purple blossoms smothering the cracks where tiny fingers once scraped for purchase. You're sorting through the harem's wardrobe when you find it. Leyla's ceremonial robe, already repurposed as a doll gown for the next child bride. The seamstress has let out all the seams, but the stain near the collar, pomegranate juice blood, remains. The Sultan hosts a poetry night in the courtyard. His new favorite recites verses comparing her lips to rosebuds, her waist to a cypress sapling. No one mentions the empty space where a 6-year-old once sat shelling pistachios with shaking hands. Later, when the wine flows freely, the court historian drunkenly confides that the official chronicle will record Leyla's death as a sudden fever, the same phrase used for 3 other child brides in as many years. As you leave through the moon gate, your boot crunches on something in the gravel. It's the cracked face of that porcelain doll, its painted smile worn smooth by countless footsteps. The last quirky detail, Ottoman miniatures always depict dolls with blank faces, because capturing a child's likeness was considered bad luck. Maybe they were right. The first anniversary of Leyla's death passes unmarked in the palace scrolls, but you find the remembrance in unexpected places. A scullery maid leaves a handful of hazelnuts at the base of the old fig tree, the same treat Leyla used to sneak from the kitchens. The nuts go untouched for 3 days before the palace cats scatter them, their tiny teeth leaving perfect crescents in the shells. Up in the scriptorium, a scribe accidentally drips wax over the entry recording the Sultan's latest wedding plans, obscuring the bride's age with a crimson blot. When the head librarian scolds him, he claims the candle trembled in a draught. Neither man mentions the absence of children's laughter in the courtyard below. Here's a mainstream fact that tastes like ash. Ottoman inheritance laws required waiting 1 lunar year before redistributing a deceased wife's dowry. Leyla's miniature jewelry, those tiny rings and bracelets that never fit properly, were melted down last week into a single gold button for the Sultan's new ceremonial coat. The court jeweler added extra copper to the alloy, muttering about how pure gold is too soft for daily wear. Historians still argue whether this was practical metallurgy or quiet protest. Meanwhile, in the harem baths, the tiles where Leyla once slipped and skinned her knee have mysteriously loosened, tripping 2 grown concubines before the eunuchs ordered them replaced. You're copying tax records in the archives when your stylus catches on an anomaly, a single line item between the silk imports and olive oil revenues. For the Armenian physician, 12 akçe, recompense for the sleeping draught. No date, no patient named, but the ink is the same deep gall black used in Leyla's final medical notes. Tracking down the ledger's scribe leads you to a wine shop near the docks, where the now retired clerk nurses a cup of overstepped sage tea. His hands shake as he recounts how the palace summoned every doctor within 3 days' ride that last terrible night. The Armenian was the only one who looked at the Sultan's face instead of the coin purse when giving his prognosis. The sleeping draft payment appears exactly once in 30 years of records, a quirky detail that survived in the spice merchant's logs. That same week, the palace ordered triple the usual saffron, alongside an unusual request for the white poppies from the high meadows. The merchant's notation in the margin reads, "Not for cooking," in shaky script. Down by the fish market, the old women still tell a version of this story over their gutting tables, claiming certain poppy fields bloom brighter where blood has soaked the soil. They say if you listen at the Moon Pavilion's eastern window when the wind blows from the north, you can sometimes hear a child humming that damned wedding song. You try it once. The breeze carries only salt and seabirds, which is somehow worse. 2 years pass like a slow blink. The Sultan takes a new wife, a buxom Georgian princess of 16, and the court exhales in collective relief. No one mentions how he still walks the sea wall at odd hours, fingering something small and white in his pocket. You're inventorying the palace storerooms when you find Leyla's remaining possessions stuffed behind a crate of mouldering ledgers. A single embroidered slipper, its mate lost during her illness, a hair ribbon still tangled with strands of fine brown hair, and most hauntingly, a wax tablet where she'd practiced her letters. The stylus had pressed too hard on one corner, leaving a permanent indentation of the Ottoman word for help, repeated 17 times in shaky columns. The palace steward snatches the tablet from your hands, melting it down for candle wax that very night. The resulting taper burns with an odd blue flame during the next divan meeting, making the viziers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Here's a mainstream fact that explains nothing. Ottoman law required childless wives' belongings to be destroyed to prevent spiritual residue. But the palace seamstresses tell a different story over their embroidery frames, how certain items always seem to reappear, no matter how thoroughly they're burned or buried. One swears she recently mended a child's shift with the exact same crooked stitch Leyla always used, though all the girl's needlework was supposedly tossed into the Bosphorus. Historians still argue whether this was mass hysteria or quiet resistance from servants who remembered. That night, you catch a kitchen girl leaving a bowl of milk near the fig tree, exactly where Leyla used to feed the palace cats. When questioned, she claims it's for the jinn. The cats drink it anyway. The Sultan falls ill during the Ramadan fast. His physicians diagnose melancholic humors and prescribe baths in ass's milk, but the harem whispers no better. You're polishing silver in the treasury when the Georgian queen bursts in, her cheeks streaked with cold tears. She throws a gold-threaded purse at your feet. Inside, the Sultan's collection of baby teeth rattles like dice. He calls her name in his sleep. She hisses before the eunuchs drag her away. That evening, the muezzin's call sounds particularly strained as it echoes over a palace holding its breath. In the infirmary, the Sultan's fevered hands pluck at his sheets, twisting the fabric into shapes resembling swaddled infants. The Armenian physician watches from the corner, his satchel conspicuously devoid of sleeping draughts this time. A quirky detail from the astrologer's notes. The night Leyla died, Saturn aligned with Mars in the house of Venus, a configuration believed to curse marriages. The same alignment occurs tonight as the Sultan's breathing grows labored. Down in the city, a street vendor selling Sultan's Delight sweets suddenly changes his sign to Leyla's Comfort, coating his honey pastries in an unusual lavender sugar. The crowd devours them anyway. By dawn, the palace announces the Sultan's miraculous recovery, though witnesses say his first act was to fire every physician who attended Leyla. The only exception? The Armenian, who left Constantinople months ago with no forwarding address. His final ledger entry simply states, "The weight of a child's soul is approximately equal to a handful of poppy seeds." The Sultan's recovery celebration lasts 40 days and 40 nights, long enough for the court to forget the way his hands still shake when passing the moon pavilion. You're serving sherbet in the audience hall when his new Georgian queen drops her fan. As you kneel to retrieve it, your fingers brush against something wedged beneath the divan. A tiny wooden horse, its paint worn smooth from anxious handling. The toy smells faintly of lavender and camphor, the same scent Leyla's nursemaid used in her linen chest. When you discreetly show it to a passing eunuch, he pales and whispers, "That belonged to the little one from Konya," before hurrying away. The next morning the toy disappears, but you find wood shavings near the palace gates where someone burned it. The ashes still smell like lavender when the wind shifts. Here's a mainstream fact that explains nothing. Ottoman toy makers often included hidden compartments in their designs, a holdover from when spies used children's playthings to smuggle messages. Leyla's horse had one too, empty now except for a single shriveled cherry pit. Historians still argue whether this was a child's treasure or something more sinister. That afternoon, the Sultan's chief treasurer audits the Harem accounts and discovers a discrepancy, exactly 12 akçe missing, the same amount paid to the Armenian physician years prior. No one admits to the theft, but the next week, a donation appears at a local orphanage in that exact amount, earmarked for medicinal sweets. 5 years slip by like water through a sieve. The Sultan fathers 3 healthy sons with his Georgian queen, though palace gossips note he never attends their naming ceremonies. You're copying marriage contracts in the chancery when an earthquake rattles the inkwells, just a minor tremor, but strong enough to dislodge a brick in the old harem wall. Behind it someone has stuffed a child's embroidered sash, the thread still bright after all this time. The pattern shows tulips and pomegranates intertwined, an ironic motif for a girl who never lived to see either bloom. When you show it to the head seamstress, her eyes well up as she identifies the stitchwork. This was old Fatima's style. God rest her, she always put an extra knot in the hem for protection. A quirky detail from the palace gardener's log. The fig tree where Leyla used to play stopped bearing fruit the year she died. Yet every spring, its roots push up strange treasures, a mother-of-pearl button, a scrap of indigo-dyed wool, last week a single silver earring shaped like a crescent moon. The groundskeepers leave these objects undisturbed beneath the tree, where the cats sometimes bat them around like toys. That night, as you walk past the moon pavilion, a gust of wind carries the faint scent of lavender and burnt sugar. The shutters rattle just once, though there's no breeze to move them. You could swear you hear a child's laughter, but when you turn, there's only the empty courtyard and the indifferent stars. A decade turns like a slow grindstone. The Sultan's beard has gone grey at the temples, his once sharp eyes now milky with cataracts. You're summoned to his private chambers one autumn evening, not as a servant, but as a witness. He sits by the brazier, turning something small and white between his fingers, Leyla's last surviving baby tooth. "They told me she was just a vessel," he murmurs, "not to you but to the shadows, that the seed matters more than the soil." Outside, the wind carries the scent of the first winter rains, the kind that used to make Leyla press her nose to the lattice windows, marveling at how the drops turned the courtyard stones to liquid silver. The mainstream histories will claim the Sultan died of a sudden ague, but you were there when he refused the physician's tonic, pushing the cup away with a hand steadier than it had been in years. That night, the palace cats congregate outside his door in silent vigil, their tails flicking like metronomes keeping time for a song only they remember. By dawn, the servants find him cold, his fingers still curled around that tiny tooth now stained amber from decades of anxious handling. The court poets will call it a pious end. You know better. They bury the Sultan beneath a marble dome heavy with carved tulips, but the real memorial happens in the shadows. As workers dismantle his bedchamber, you watch a slave girl, no older than Leyla was, scoop up the ashes from his brazier and toss them into the golden horn. The wind catches them, scattering grey flakes like muktaschi over the water. Down in the spice market, the old women nod knowingly when the news arrives. The Bosphorus remembers, mutters one, crushing dried lavender between her palms. It always gives back what it's owed. That night, the fig tree blooms for the first time in 15 years. The fruit is small and strangely sweet, bursting with seeds that stain the cobbles crimson when they fall. The palace cats refuse to touch it, but the orphanage children devour the harvest within days, their lips stained purple as kings. No one comments on how their games change afterward, how they build elaborate palaces from sticks and declare one girl the little sultana, before dissolving into giggles. Only you notice the crude doll they fashion from fig leaves and twine, its face deliberately left blank. When the wind catches it, the doll seems to curtsy, its leaf skirt rustling like a sigh. Generations pass. The palace becomes a museum, its harem chambers now roped off behind velvet barriers. You linger near a display case containing a child's embroidered slipper, labeled simply 19th century, owner unknown, when a tour guide mentions offhand that staff refuse to clean this gallery after midnight. The dust here moves strangely, she confides to wide-eyed tourists. No one notices the faint lavender scent clinging to the case, or how the security cameras mysteriously malfunction every year on the same date, the day of Leyla's wedding, according to the old Ottoman calendar. A historian's thesis will later argue that child brides were statistically insignificant in Ottoman demographics, a footnote in imperial records. But in the museum's restoration lab, a conservator finds something peculiar beneath layers of varnish on a harem wall, the faint but unmistakable outline of a small hand, fingers splayed as if pushing against the world. The infrared camera reveals more. Dozens of names scratched into the plaster beneath centuries of paint, each in a different childish script. The oldest, written in shaky Arabic near the floor, simply says, "Leyla was here." Moonlight filters through the museum's stained glass as you're the last to leave. The night guard yawns by the exit, oblivious to the faint click of a latch disengaging in the distant harem gallery. Down in the gift shop, a cluster of porcelain dolls sits gathering dust, their faces deliberately left blank in authentic Ottoman style. One has toppled over, its tiny hand pointing toward the seawall where the Sultan once stood vigil. Outside, the Bosphorus glitters with reflected city lights, its currents carrying cherry pits and poppy seeds and things too small to name. Somewhere beyond the tide, a 6-year-old's laughter mingles with the cry of gulls. The water remembers what the history books omit. The echoes fade slowly tonight, like rosewater evaporating from a copper basin. That faint lavender scent lingering in your room. Pay it no mind. The fig tree outside your window bearing inexplicable fruit this late in the season. Merely a trick of the light. History is full of quiet corners where lost things wait, patient as poppy seeds in frozen earth. Perhaps tomorrow you'll visit a museum and pause a little longer at some unremarkable display, a toy horse, a child's slipper, a wall with oddly warm plaster, or perhaps you'll simply listen more closely when the wind carries a melody that sounds almost like a lute song transposed to a minor key. Either way, the past never truly leaves us. It lingers in the spaces between heartbeats, in the hush before sleep claims you. The candles have burned low now, the shadows grow soft at the edges. Let them carry what they must into the night.